A very good evening, and I welcome everyone to this interesting session on pediatric ophthalmology and strabismus.
And let me just introduce. So we have our moderator here, Dr. Sableen Kaur. She's an assistant professor working in the pediatric ophthalmology division here in PGI, Chandigarh. And she would be moderating this session on pediatric ophthalmology and strabismus. So I now request Sableen to start the session.
Thank you, sir. Again, welcome everyone to this session. We are excited to have a very nice panel here today with us, fabulously joined by Dr. Rohit Saxena, who is a professor at Rajendra Prasad Center for Ophthalmic Sciences, New Delhi. Also, Dr. Pandey, ex-director professor, MAMC Guru Nanak Eye Center, New Delhi, now working as an adjunct professor at the ESI Medical College, Faridabad. They are joined by Dr. Srishti Raj, who is a professor at the Advanced Eye Center, PGI Chandigarh, and Dr. Jaspreet, again heading the Pediatric Ophthalmology and Neuro-Ophthalmology Services at Advanced Eye Center, Chandigarh. We have a set of speakers with us, eminently from all over the northern India. We'll begin with Dr. Pandey, who is an ex-director professor from Maulana Azad Medical College. After serving 35 years in the institute and doing exceptional clinical and research work in the institute, he retired and then joined ESI Medical College, Faridabad. I welcome you, sir. Personally, he was a teacher to me during my junior residency, and I continue to learn a lot from him. Welcome, and thank you for agreeing to participate in this session today. After him, if we can move on. We have Dr. Jaspreet, who is now at present the president of this Chandigarh Ophthalmological Society and has organized a great meeting, although virtual, but a lot of sessions and very interactive with a mix of almost all specialities. He was busy organizing the conference and has found time to join us in this session. I welcome you, sir, for the pediatric ophthalmology session. We then have Dr. Amit Gupta, a fabulous surgeon and a ex-fellow at LV Prasad Institute, right now doing a lot of work in the northern area in Kapilai Hospital in Ambala. He caters to a large population, a pediatric population, and is doing wonderful work in his area. We have nonetheless Dr. Rohit Saxena. He's a professor at RP Center and would be sharing his insights on myopia. I think he needs no introduction. His work has spoken volumes about him, research, clinical, surgical, and his expert talks are always, we always enjoy listening to you, sir. We're very happy that you could join us today. And once again, I welcome you to this Chandigarh Ophthalmological Society Symposium. We then have Dr. Shweta Churasia, who is working as an associate professor at Advanced Eye Center, Chandigarh. She would be sharing her thoughts on CVI, and she has been following up these patients over the last few years and has developed a fine clinical interest in this area. She's also doing fabulous surgical work and is a valuable addition to our team in PGI. Welcome, Dr. Shweta. Thank you so much. I think Dr. Jaspreet has already introduced me. Without wasting much time, I would invite Dr. Pandey to deliver his talk. He would be talking about congenital third nerve palsy as CCDS. Dr. Pandey, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Sableen and Dr. Jaspreet, for this invitation to participate in this excellent webinar of the annual Chandigarh Ophthalmological Society. It is a pleasure to be with you all, and I'll be talking about congenital third nerve palsies, as we all have encountered these palsies once in a while and we found them quite challenging. Maybe it is diagnosis or it is management. The point of my presentation is to share some insights regarding some of these palsies being as congenital cranial degeneration disorders. I'll just produce evidence, and there has been already been imaging evidence that about 20 to 30% of these third nerve palsies, they show hypoplasia of the third nerve on MRI. This goes to about 70% with the fourth nerve palsies. You can also have superior oblique hypoplasia. So these need to be classed as CCDDs, rather just congenital third nerve palsies. Now, CCDDs, the concept, this is abnormal congenital eye, eyelid, and/or facial movements. These could be heritable or sporadic. These are developmental abnormalities of the cranial nuclei and/or nerves. There is a primary disinnervation, that means there is lack of innervation. And the secondary disinnervation, that means there is aberrant innervation from the other nerves. Now the list is very long, and third nerve and fourth nerve palsies are later additions. Otherwise, the list is expanding with time, with progress in imaging and genetics. Now, on MRI, as I said, it has been shown that about 1/3 of third nerve palsies will show evidence of CN3 hypoplasia, and about 70% of fourth nerve palsies may show hypoplasia or aplasia of the fourth nerve and the superior oblique muscle. So that is strong evidence that these are CCDDs. I'll be presenting 3 cases with aberrant innervation beyond third nerve. In some of them, it is also with the prenuclear structures to show that these are not just plain third nerve palsies, but these are CCDDs. Now, this is first child, is an 8-year-old boy who presented with poor vision and outward deviation of the right eye since birth. There is a right XO of about 50 and hypotropy of 15 prism diopters. There is a right head tilt, as you can see. Pupil is spared, and there is no gross restriction to elevation on force duction test. So the findings look like there is a third nerve palsy with little tilt to the right side. Now this is showing 9-gaze montage. You can see clearly that there is a large XO. There's very little ptosis in the right eye, and and as the eye goes up, this goes into adduction, and there is convergence, which quite often you can see in CFM particularly, and some of the third nerve palsies also show some convergence in up gaze and divergence in down gaze. Now, when the child is looking to the left side, there is little divergence. This is like his eye is not elevating so much. If I can show with the here as compared to the other pictures in up gaze, you can see that this eye is diverging. This is part of the synergistic divergence, as we will be talking about it later. And in down gaze, the right eye is elevating. Now tilts were not these things. They were not positive. They were not remarkable. Now this is showing a small video about. Now there is no nystagmus in the primary position, but when he looks to the right side, you can see a jerk nystagmus beating towards the right, and there's no nystagmus. Now once he looks to the left side, you can see that this eye goes down, and there is upbeat nystagmus in the right eye, which shows that there is probably a vestibular disturbance, which is causing a gaze evoked nystagmus with having both horizontal and vertical components. Horizontal mainly in the left eye and vertical in the right eye. Now, right eye showed some intorsion, which maybe one may say that this is because of superior oblique overaction. Let us see. And left eye torsion was relatively within normal limits. Now, when this child was made to look up, this is something very peculiar happened, that there is gross extorsion. The eye which was intorted, right eye, has got into gross extorsion, and the left eye, which was supposedly normal looking eye, which has gone into intorsion. So this is a conjugate torsion, which is classically seen in ocular tilt reactions, which have 3 components: the conjugate torsion, the hypotropia, and tilt to the same side, to the side of the hypotropia. Now, if this is tonic, you will have this picture. If it is phasic, then you may have opposite picture. Phasic means that there is excitatory lesion, and tonic means there is an inhibitory lesion. We'll come to that later if there is time. Now, this is showing MRI brain and ultrasound abdomen. You can see that there is a right MR hypoplasia, which can be seen on MRI, and on the USG abdomen, there is absence of the left kidney, and the picture is not coming, the last picture, which shows there is right cryptorchidism, which is getting hidden because of this. So he had left absent kidney and right cryptorchidism, which was part of the systemic presentation. Now what we are dealing with, this is of course, pupil sparing control third nerve palsy with extensive disinnervation and with systemic presentation involvement. Now, novel features I just like to enumerate. One is the gaze evoked phasic ocular tilt reaction. You can see the the intorsion in this eye. As it goes up, this goes into gross conjugate torsion with intorsion of the left eye and extorsion of the right eye. This is seen classically only in ocular tilt reactions. This kind of picture, which is very gross, you can't mix it up with something. Now this is showing graviceptive pathways. As you can see that from the vestibule, they go to from the ventricle and semicircular canals, they will go to the vestibular nuclei. From there, they will synapse in the vestibular nuclei, cross at the level of the sixth nerve nucleus, go to the opposite MLF, ascend in the MLF till the RIMLF and on the way to INC. And that's where they sort of end at the RIMLF. So any lesion along this path can give rise to an ocular tilt reaction, which has three components, as I have said. So this child, for some reason, is sharing these features. That means there is associated involvement of the autolytic pathways along with the picture of the third nerve palsy. Now, next, as I said, there's a gaze-evoked vestibular nystagmus. There is the INC is at the level of the midbrain, which is giving rise to vertical gaze holding and giving rise to torsional nystagmus in this patient, most likely. And at the level of the pons, you have nucleus prepositus hypoglossi, which is for the horizontal gaze holding, and along with these vestibular nuclei there, and this is probably giving rise to horizontal jerk nystagmus. The most important thing to keep in mind is that there is no nystagmus in primary position. Only when eye goes into side gazes, there is a nystagmus which appears. This is just showing the structures which could be involved in this case, like the vestibular nuclei, the sixth nerve, the MLF as it is ascending, and till the INC, which all these structures likely are affected in this child along with the right third nerve. Now the synergistic divergence involving this child, as you saw, as the eye goes into the left gaze, the right eye also diverges and goes in up gaze. So this is because of the involvement of the synergistic divergence, which is along with the third nerve palsy and happening at the level of the pons. So the midbrain and pons both are affected in this child. With third nerve palsies, I think HD has not been described. Of course, you have cases with CFM3 and Duane's retraction syndrome, but with third nerve palsy, I think HD has not been described to best of my knowledge. Now we also have cryptorchidism and renal aplasia in this child, which are not classically seen with the third nerve palsy. Usually they are seen with ectorenal ocular syndromes, Okihoro, Holt-Oram, and DURS. And the genetics is usually PAX2 and SALL4 mutations. Now this is the second child. He also had right congenital third nerve palsy, pupil sparing. As you can see, he's having a face turn to the right, and as he's also having synergistic divergence. And as he goes into the left gaze, there is synergistic divergence, and the eye tends to go down. In that child, the eye was going up. This one is going down. We can see the video in the next. Now, as he opens his mouth, there is adduction, and as he moves his jaw, there is medial rectus is getting activated. There is no ptosis in this child, but medial rectus is getting activated. So instead of what you classically see in MGP, here there is no ptosis, but medial rectus has got latched on with the external pterygoids. So this is a sort of you can say an aberrant MGP. Only one case I could find in literature, but the details were not there. But I think that was third nerve palsy or not, I cannot say. That was in 2004. There is no other case which I could find in literature. This is third case which I will be talking. This is a girl of about 12-year-old with left pupil involving third nerve palsy. And when there is a ptosis, there is. Now, when she just presses over her left upper lid, there is the lid opens. Nothing happens to the ocular movements or the pupil, and there is extensive watering. So what is happening here is that the molars muscle is there, which has the supply from the sympathetic as well as proprioception from the fifth nerve. Now, because of the proprioception, the molars is getting activated, and this is causing opening of the lid, which stays for about 1 minute, and then again it droops, and when she will press again, it will again happen. The same thing can be repeated. Now, to summarize, there may be more to congenital third nerve palsies than meets the eye. This innervation may involve fifth nerve, the prenuclear structures like autolytic pathways and sympathetic. Think of congenital third nerve palsies as once you are diagnosing as CCDDs when you are considering third nerve palsies in differential diagnosis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Those were wonderful cases and beautiful videos. For the sake of time, we can take one question, maybe just to keep it interactive. Anybody from the panel would like to ask Dr. Pandey a question? In the meantime, the next presentation is being shared.
Yes, so I mean, those are complex cases, and what do you find usually on imaging? I mean, how does that appear? Like if there is nuclear hypoplasia or missing nucleus? I mean, how do you does the do the radiology people help you in these things, or how is it like? What are your findings there in MRI?
Yeah, actually, you need a specific imaging techniques like spin echo and other techniques which are there. But unfortunately, in our setup, they have done MRI. But as I showed you, they could only find hypoplasia of the medial rectus, which is classically seen in synaptic divergence. They could not visualize the third nerve or fourth nerve or sixth nerve. Out of these three nerves, the nuclei are not easy to visualize. You can visualize the third, fourth, sixth nerve. Out of these three nerves, the third nerve is about 1.8 millimeters, the fourth is about 0.58 or so, and the sixth is about 1 millimeter. So to visualize fourth nerve is far more difficult, but third is the thickest, about 2 millimeters. But unfortunately, they have not been able to visualize in these cases, all three cases. So that's why I have not talked about that. And of course, genetic studies also could not be done. The genetics could be very complicated in these cases because these are sporadic cases. So we don't know some mutation might have happened. So I think it will take some time before we get more insights into such situations.
So how do you obviously surgeries must be complex. So how do you counsel these cases, and what are the surgical results in such cases?
Surgical results are not very good, obviously, because there are too many things together. Otherwise, also third nerve pulses are not easy surgical material. And in these cases, because of so much of disinnervation, they are difficult situations, and there's always patients are not very happy because they expect that with surgery they are going to be perfect. So a little bit of disappointment, but I did operate on the first child, but he was not happy, and then after that he was lost to follow because all that disinnervation there is no way to correct.
Rohit, any suggestions, comments?
For the sake of time, if we could just have the next talk and we can have more discussion in the end. Thank you so much, sir, for sharing your insights. Oh, Doctor. I would just call upon Dr. Jasprit for his talk on intermittent exotropia. Dr. Jasprit.
So in the time I load, I think Rohit can give us whatever he was.
Rohit, please.
Nothing excellent cases. I have interacted with Dr. Pandey on these, but management of third nerve can be extremely difficult. And these are, of course, with multisystemic problems. And probably the systemic management is far more important in these cases, assessing the other associated anomalies that these children may have. And that is far more important than, and manage refractive errors and amblyopia, which are, of course, frequently seen with them. So those are key interventions before you think of surgery. But excellent talk, Dr. Pandey.
Thank you, Dr. Thank you so much.
Thank you once again. So, of course, I'll start off with some disconnections probably, which do occur during the connection. So it does disconnect. So probably these connections with disconnect should be what I'll be talking about is intermittent exotropia. So I think it's recorded. Probably just let me know if the voice is low, then I can speak otherwise.
This entity is the commonest form of exotropia, which manifests more for distance fixation and occurs more when a patient is tired or during a cover test as seen in this video. It ranges from an exophoria to an exotropia with suppression during the manifest phase. The patient usually does not have any symptoms. However, children tend to close the deviating eye in bright sunlight to avoid diplopia as there is loss of fusional convergence. Parents notice the intermittent deviation when the child is about 2 years old. These children, when examined, may not manifest the deviation in the clinic. So a careful history has to be elicited from parents with a look at old photographs. Sensory examination reveals binocular single vision with good stereopsis for near and suppression when manifesting for distance. Some may have a panoramic field. Visual acuity is preserved in these children as the deviation is intermittent to start and alternating sometimes. Cover test may show the deviation as a basic XT or a true divergence excess, which is related to the fusional and or accommodative convergence mechanism. Orthoptic testing is important to identify the type of exotropia for management. Far distance measurement should always be performed in these cases. The change in deviation at distance and near would guide us to perform the diagnostic occlusion of one eye for an hour, which would decrease fusional convergence, and thereafter, if required, a +3 diopter lens for near to identify accommodative convergence. The near point of convergence should also be checked at baseline as well as any deficit in lateral gaze. We would thus know if it is simulated or a true divergence excess with a normal or a high AC by A ratio. Now, all these parameters like visual acuity, control score, convergence, stereo acuity, and of course doing the cover test are important in planning the management of the patient. The first step in management is to refract these patients and prescribe them appropriate correction. Usually there is anisometropia, and providing glasses may help to have better control of the deviation. However, more than 3 diopters should be prescribed in a tailored manner as it would eliminate visual blur, thus improving the chances for fusion. However, the reduction or increment should be similar in the two eyes. Non-surgical therapy includes orthoptic exercises, which are fusional convergence and anti-suppression exercises. These may benefit some children. Alternate day occlusion has been shown by Kushner to be effective in controlling the deviation by reducing the suppression. Over-minus therapy is a reasonable alternative as a temporary measure, and those with high AC by A ratio benefit immensely from it. This is the same patient which I had shown in the starting of this presentation. She had an AC by A ratio of 5 with a distance XT of 18 prism diopter. We prescribed her -2.5 diopters, and the deviation was well controlled with binocular single vision for distance and no asthenopic symptoms. Such measures are required for binocularity and maintaining control along with cosmesis. But what is the natural cause of intermittent exotropia? From various studies with a follow-up ranging from 3 years to 11 years, improvement was seen in 1/3 of cases, with most showing stability and a very few deterioration. So it is quite variable, and repeated follow-up is required to monitor the progression. Now, how do we quantify control when these patients come for follow-up? There is a scoring system to quantify control, which includes home and office control. In the home control, the informants are the parents, and it might not be so accurate, wherein in the clinic, the deviation might be absent. Some of the scoring systems which are popular are the Newcastle control score, which includes a home score and a clinic control score for both near and distance. Then again, you have a Mayo Clinic XT score, where the scoring is done from 0 to 10, with 0 being good and 10 being worse. Then you have the Kushner's classification of control, which ranges from poor to excellent. Now, coming to these surgical options, we have the botulinum toxin first. In those with poor control, this has been used with injections into both lateral rectors, and stable alignment was achieved in 69% at a 1 to 4 years follow-up in one of the studies. They showed that the best outcome was between children 2 to 5 years of age. So what are the surgical options in these patients? Most of them are basic exotropias. So you could do either a recess resect or a bilateral lateral rectal recession. However, lateral incompetence should be taken into account for surgical dosing. Those with true divergence excess should preferably undergo bilateral lateral rectal recession. These could be on adjustable in cooperative patients. The aim of surgery is temporary diplopia in an older child and avoidance of esotropia in a younger child. In adults, they do tolerate undercorrection with a lower risk of exodrift. Achieving a cosmetic cure is possible in many patients with intermittent XT. However, functional cure varies from 40 to 95%. To summarize, observation with follow-up is a conservative way of managing children with intermittent exotropia, and surgery can be offered to those losing control. Surgical correction at 3 or less than 3 years of age is associated with high overcorrection rate and poor sensory outcome than children who are operated at an older age.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. A very illustrative presentation covering all aspects of intermittent exotropia. If anybody in the panel would like to ask, we'll just take one question. And I would also request Dr. Amit Gupta in the meantime to share his presentation on infantile esotropia.
Dr. Jaspreet, I want to continue orthotics, if that is given at a first choice.
I think the incidence is rising because of rise in incidence of myopia, and you are seeing sort of explosion in China and Singapore and those countries. I think our incidence is also rising with these intermittent exodeviations. Earlier, I think we were not seeing so much of, we're seeing a lot of ESOs also, but now ESOs have gone into minority, and exos, I think, have overtaken by about 2:1 to my mind. So there has been a shift. What was now we have far more exos, and these are most difficult to treat because, as the presentation was, that they are very variable and they are quite deceptive at times, and you have to take multiple measurements and look at near distance disparity and a lot of issues there in management, and despite that, the results may not be very excellent all the time. Very challenging situation.
What are your views? Like, I mean, I found alternate patching. I mean, I've had really good results with whatever little I've given with the glasses in maybe 2 or 3 patients. I mean, just as a temporary measure. So what is your experience in intermittent XT?
I have not tried too much of alternate occlusion, but this over minus therapy works with only high AC by ratio. So I think in only those cases, and if the deviation is not very large, about 15-20%, if it is more than that, usually it's not. It's like a temporary measure. Alternate occlusion is good to prevent suppression, and some improvement in deviation also does happen. I think it should be tried, and I have not tried too much, but I think that's a good.
Rohit?
So recently a study has come out which has actually gone against the concept of over minus or undercorrecting plus lenses. They've actually said that it doesn't improve, and also the risk of myopic progression in these children. So of course, there's not adequate evidence that it would significantly progress myopia, but that's the fear that they have in their study, said that it was evident in their study. So it's a thing that we should be cautious about. And as I would talk in the myopia also, that undercorrecting glasses are not really a good idea. About 1:1 patch, somehow I haven't, I mean, of course, I haven't tried it much, but somehow I don't believe that that would be helpful. Rather, I mean, I would say that we want to encourage binocularity when we are looking at managing intermittent XTs. In fact, a lot of them, if you'll see, and now we've started actually looking at them, and we realize that many of the intermittent XTs have DVDs, have binocular problems, which are probably congenital in origin. So if you have a DVD presenting in an IDS, you know that the binocular problem is congenital. It's not, the DVD will not develop at 10, 12, 14 years of age. So many of the IXT cases are those who have an inherent problem in binocularity, and they're just manifesting because of the poor binocularity. And that's why, as Dr. Pandey talked about, the outcomes are not great because you don't have good peripheral fusion to control these IXTs because there is a binocular problem to start off with. So while we look at progressive deterioration of stereopsis as progression of IXT, sometimes the poor stereoacuity or binocularity may itself be a cause of the IXTs actually presenting to us and manifesting in distance but are able to control for near. So this is just a thought. I'm just saying that's why somehow I have not felt it very beneficial to give 1:1 occlusion. Rather, I would say that we should increase binocularity as much as possible.
So it's not 1:1.
Just to prevent there is suppression. If you think there is a suppression going on, maybe temporary males
Possibly, yeah.
for some time, few weeks maybe. That's
One usually
what you
gives
saying about DVD, Dr. Rohit. I think this may sort of blend over into infantile exotropia to some extent. So
Although
the gray zone probably.
Although I would say that many IXTs we've seen are, if you carefully see, do show some amount of DVDs. I mean, I initially I used to think it's just a one-off, but now we've actually started seeing in a fair number of cases. It's not just a few cases. So that's why I just feel that maybe binocularity has a far greater role, or poor binocularity at early onset would have a far greater role in these children presenting with IXT later on, and therefore not doing so great also. But I mean, of course, a lot of evidence needs to be collected, and these are very difficult cases for us to actually manage.
The problem is we are trying to correct something which is happening at the level of the CNS vergences at the peripheral level, at the level of the extraocular muscle insertions. I think that is the main mismatch probably. And
yeah,
Yes.
Thank you, sir.
yeah.
Probably.
Just was to make a point.
Yeah, so the thing is, the Kushner has just come out with a study, a long-term study with this alternate patching, and he does maybe 3 hours a day only, not 1:1, just 3 hours a day, and he's shown people. I mean, children with 12 to 15 years follow-up have maintained their binocularity and have you can say ortho with alternate patching, who are treated maybe when they were younger. So I mean, that should be looked into, and because of the long-term follow-up, what is shown.
so part-time occlusion, part-time patching, I think that's
Just 3 hours, not more than that.
yeah, that's important. I think.
Thank you so much, sir. Dr. Amit, if you could share our screen. We got wonderful insights from this talk. We need to think about the COVID pandemic increasing the exotropias, and then we need to establish the etiology, whether it was congenital, as Dr. Rohit said, and probably interim therapy with alternate patching, a paper by Kushner, which I also personally feel is very good. Dr. Amit Gupta would be talking about congenital esotropia. Dr. Amit, all yours.
Are my slides visible?
Yes, they are, and you are clearly audible. Please go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. At the outset, I'd like to thank Dr. Jaspreet and Dr. Savleen for inviting me over for Chandigarh Ophthalmological Society. It is always a pleasure to be back at Chandigarh. I've done my MBBS and MS both from Chandigarh, so it is always good to be back at Chandigarh. I'll be discussing about congenital esotropia. When do we really intervene for these children? Looking at the incidence of this problem, it affects roughly 0.5% of healthy full-term infants. And if we look at children who have certain kind of perinatal abnormalities like perinatal asphyxia or developmental delay, they have a much higher incidence of having congenital esotropia in these children. The typical characteristics would be an onset before the age of 6 months with a comitant deviation of more than 20 prism diopters of an esotropia and a cycloplegic refraction revealing a hyperopia of less than 2 to 2.5 diopters. Normal ocular motility. These children are usually cross-fixators. They have a latent nystagmus and an asymmetric optokinetic nystagmus. Before we discuss when do we intervene, it is important to know when do we don't intervene for these children. So Pediatric Eye Disease Investigator Group in one of their studies, which was congenital esotropia observational studies, where they looked at the natural progression of 170 children with congenital esotropia who were followed up over a period of time. They found out that children who had an intermittent angle of deviation, a variable angle of deviation, a small angle of deviation less than 40 prism diopters, and children who had reported less than 20 weeks after birth, 27% of these children, they had a spontaneous resolution of their esotropias. So we need to be wary of this group, and we need not intervene for these patients. So we need to closely follow them up, and we may not intervene for these. In case we have decided that we have to intervene, there has always been a debate. There has been a group which says ultra early surgery. By that I mean less than 6 months of age, early between 6 to 24 months of age, and a late surgery beyond 24 months of age. The goals of a strabismus surgery have always been to ensure a good sensory and a motor outcome, and we need to have the best possible result with least possible re-surgery rates. Importance of an early surgery would be there's a social stigma attached with strabismus for a child growing into an adult. There's a name calling, the child is constantly pointed out, the parent-child eye contact is affected, which tends to affect their relationship. Psychomotor development of the child is delayed, and these children may require multiple surgeries, which again has a psychological impact on the child. We are basically discussing about the sensory outcome, and the main emphasis would be on stereopsis. So we need to know what is the critical period of stereopsis to start in a child. It usually starts around 3 to 4 months of age, and 80 to 90% of our stereopsis has been achieved during infancy itself, and adult stereopsis is achieved by the age of 3 to 4 years. So it brings us to a point that whatever we need to do has to be done early, so in order to have a good stereopsis. Hubel and Wiesel were the first ones who looked at monkeys in the age less than 3 months, which roughly of monkeys, which roughly corresponds to 1 year of age of an infant boy, when they had induced strabismus in them either by cutting the muscles, or prismatic glasses were given which induced an infantile esotropia, and they could see a decrease in the population of binocular striate cortical neurons in these monkeys, which could redistribute, which could repopulate after their strabismus was reversed, either with the removal of the prismatic glasses or the surgery was done to correct their strabismus. And this has been looked at clinically as well. Various studies, retrospective studies have been done where they have looked at early versus late surgery, what is the amount of stereopsis that has been achieved, and early surgery has definitely had better stereopsis rates compared to a late surgical intervention. The difference has been significant, and that does make a difference. In visual evoked responses also, it has been seen that early surgery does promote cortical visual motion processing, and that would that in a way correlates with our stereopsis outcomes as well. Early versus late infantile strabismus surgery study looked at the outcomes, both sensory and motor outcomes. The motor outcomes were more or less similar in both the groups, early versus late surgery. So it does not make much of an impact in terms of the motor outcome. It is a sensory outcome, which is predominantly affected with early versus late surgery. There are certain factors also which affect the variation in results. Variation of the preoperative angle of strabismus has been seen in various studies, and it has been seen any variation in the range of 10 to 15 prism diopters does not make much of a difference in terms of the motor outcome that we see of our surgeries. Variation of the angle of relocation of the muscle insertion during surgery is very, very important, where we place our suture. Variation in anatomy in children is expected. Mechanical properties of the muscle, they tend to change a lot as we go towards a higher amount of recession, giving a more larger effect in terms of recession that we do. These are few representative pictures of children that have been operated in the last 9-10 years at the age of 8-9 months. This child was operated at the age of 8 months, again 8 months, this was again 8 months, this was 9 months. And these children have completed 8-9 years of follow-up. This child has a stereopsis of 50 seconds of arc. This child has a stereopsis of 70 seconds. This one has 100 seconds. This has 200 seconds. So we can ensure a good outcome provided we operate them early. We can have a good stereopsis. Late surgery also has a good outcome in terms of a motor outcome, perfectly aligned, but they don't have any stereopsis at all. But all is not well for early surgery. This child was operated at the age of 8 months, biomedial recession done, orthophoric for 1.5 years, went into consecutive exotropia, again underwent a surgical intervention where a medial rectus advancement was done and was orthophoric, and has completed now 7-8 years of follow-up. Ing et al., they looked at the percentage of patients who have been aligned within the first 12 months of misalignment versus those who were aligned after 12 months of misalignment. They found out that definitely the amount of stereopsis achieved in children who were aligned within 12 months of misalignment had a better outcome in terms of their sensory outcome. Bursch et al. Also looked at the age of the children where they were operated at 5 to 8 months versus 9 to 12 months. there was not much difference in terms of their sensory outcome. So any child who's operated in an infantile age group would have more or less equivalent results according to them sensory outcomes. There was another very good study by Bosch et al. Where they looked at in a multiple regression analysis, duration of misalignment is the single most important factor in determining stereopsis for a child who undergoes strabismus surgery for infantile esotropia. There's another advantage with stereopsis. Patients with stereopsis are less likely to have a DVD or a loss of alignment in future compared to patients who don't have stereopsis. So stereopsis would have an additional measure in the sense that the early surgery rates would also be lesser in these children. Early surgery also is beneficial for visual and motor development of children. That is known to everybody now. Triclinos et al. In a mathematical model where they looked at decision analysis and they looked at the children who were operated in ultra early age group, and a late age group. The children who were operated in ultra early age group, the number of resurgeries were definitely more, but the stereopsis was also more. And as the age advanced, the number of resurgeries reduced, and so was the reduction in the amount of stereopsis that was achieved in children. So in a trade-off, they ultimately concluded that the risk-benefit ratio is beneficial to correct large angle esotropia early. They also mention in their discussion that late surgery is presumed to give a good surgical result, but this does not go along with a robust evidence in the literature that late surgery does ensure a good outcome. Pre-surgeries are required in roughly 50% of those children as well, as can be seen in this study as well. I'll go on to conclude that when we are discussing early versus late surgery with our patients, we need to have a trade-off. We need to tell them whatever are the advantages, that we can have a good binocularity, but we run the risk of resurgery and a spontaneous resolution. Current evidence is definitely in favor of an early surgery, so they need to make an informed discussion whether they want an early surgery or a late surgery. Of course, the surgeon's personal experience has also should be taken into account. Definitely a randomized controlled trial would be needed to justify whether at what age we should be doing the surgery, but for ethical concerns that is definitely a problem, and for logistical reasons. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Amit. I think wonderfully summarized. I particularly liked your last slide. I think it's a trade-off, and we have to assess the risk-benefit ratio. I would invite Dr. Rohit for his talk, and in the meantime, if we can have maybe one question that the panel would like to ask Dr. Amit.
Dr. Amit, what is the age you would like to operate in these children?
I usually keep an age in between of 8 to 10 months. I tell them that this is the age group I prefer, but most of the parents, they come back and they ask, what is your opinion? I tell them that this is my opinion, but you have an increased risk of resurgery, but we can have a good binocularity.
But
so ultimately, decision has to be the patient's.
But many such children at this age might not manifest a DVD, which might manifest later on. So how many cases like you have dealt with DVD later on, and for which you have to operate?
As of now, I have operated in the last 10 years. I would have operated in this age group, 8 to 10 years, roughly 50 to 55 children. And I have done resurgeries in hardly 3 to 4 of these children. 2-3 are pending. So it would amount to roughly 20% of these children would require resurgeries. A lot of them, 55 to 60% of them, they do have a very good stereopsis as well. I mentioned in one of the studies that the children who have stereopsis, they have a lesser risk of having a DVD and a risk of having a loss of realignment again. So that is a benefit to them also.
Thank you, Dr. Amit. We now move ahead.
One question.
Yes,
sir. For parents' perspective, they may understand alignment, but they may not understand binocular vision and stereopsis. How do you explain them?
Sir, for them, I usually demonstrate either with a Titmus fly or a Randot what is stereopsis. So, or by occluding one of their eyes, that this is the difference your child feels. Would have, or another very easy way to make them understand is when you go to watch 3D movies, they are not able to perceive those movies. They'll see them as a 2D movie. That is the easiest way to make them understand in the current scenario.
But your results have been outstanding, I think, Tamil. I think a lot of, if you look at literature, they would report more than one surgery for infantile deviations on an average, if you look at last series. And DVD and inferior oblique overaction usually come a bit later. So even if you had good alignment, some of these will go in for DVD and primary inferior oblique overaction. And so these are different, they are sort of like fellow travelers with infantile deviations. So they have their own trajectory, I think. So maybe not all the time they go in a very. And the other thing is that binocularity is like a language learned in young age. So we have to restore it as soon as and as fast as possible, of course, given the circumstances. So it is like a language because we are born as two parallel monocular visual systems and as frontal-eyed animals, and we integrate this. The wiring has to take place in the occipital cortex. So if that doesn't happen, there is going to be a problem. So I think that has to be understood that these are different deviations than any other deviation, like accommodative deviations. So we need to treat them differently from all other deviations.
Another thing, we need to go back to the history. When Wirth and Shavas, they started nature versus, so we need to have that also in mind, that these children were not inherently born with loss of stereopsis. Their stereopsis is not developing because they are misaligned. So we can make them develop their stereopsis as well.
Yeah, that's why alignment is important, but these are different cup of tea, I think, and some of them can end up with, they might have a DRS, they may have a CFUM. So a lot of things which are riding piggyback with infantile deviation. So these are complex pictures, I think. Mobius syndrome particularly. So it may look like infantile deviation, ESO, and it may be Mobius. Some of Mobius can also be EXO. So it's a very complicated presentation at times. Thank you so much. Very nice presentation.
We now move on to a topic I think of interest to everybody these days. That's childhood myopia. When and how to intervene. Dr. Rohit, sir, please.
Thank you, Sableen. Thank you, Chandigarh Ophthalmic Society, Dr. Jaspreet, and the whole team there for giving me this opportunity. My slides are moving. Yeah, okay, great.
Yes, they're moving. Yes, they're moving.
Great. So essentially, first question is, why do we want to intervene? And now, of course, as we all now are pretty well aware that there are major issues all over the world and now in India. Myopia is projected to affect virtually 50% of the world's population by 2050, a paper that got published in Ophthalmology. Prevalence is increasing definitely in younger generations, including India. We had done this meta-analysis over the last 4 decades, and we found that there is a definite increase, particularly in rural areas, which we used to think are kind of safe from this. So probably the urbanization of rural areas is increasing myopia load there. By 2050, it may become the most common cause of irreversible blindness. And there is clear evidence that slowing or limiting myopic progression will reduce the risk of vision-threatening changes. And we know that more than 5 diopters, there is a marked increase in the risk of developing cataract, glaucoma, retinal detachment. So why we know is a pretty simple question to answer. When do we intervene? So the decision to intervene should be based on risk factor identification. So there should be justifiable risk factors, which would mean baseline refractive error, the magnitude of refractive error, the age of onset, the genetics or the parental refractive errors, and the visual environmental conditions, which we know are particularly adversarial in this last 1.5 years with a lot of near activity and very significantly reduced outdoor activity. The other decision that important issue that matters is documenting myopic progression. Now, first time you see a child, unless you're very, very sure, document myopic progression at least 0.5 diopters a year before you start any form of intervention. You could, of course, get that by knowing that there is a frequent change of glasses. Risk factors characterization is important. Younger the age of onset, the more at risk they are. Progressive that are rapidly, we know the rapid progression is between 6 to 11 years of age. History of myopic parents, higher myopia or rapid progression. So high myopia at the onset when they were diagnosed, or an evidence of rapid progression. Females somehow have been shown to show a faster progression than males with not very clear reasons. Ethnicity, we know importantly that Asian, which essentially means East Asian children versus Indian and or European children. So maybe Indians come closer to European in their progression and their risk factors at the moment. The visual environment, of course, there is clear evidence that myopic children are those who spend less time outdoors, a strong association between myopia development and progression with close reading and continuous reading for long hours, and some inconsistent association with physical attributes, with calcium, with night light on. So these are very low risk factors which are not clear. So how would you intervene? The key thing is communicate, educate parents, guardians, teachers, and everybody, and of course the patient also. Assess myopic refractive error and document its progression. Perform essential baseline examination and measure ocular biometric parameters. Discuss treatment options, the benefits, the efficacy of the various treatment modalities and their risks. Set realistic expectations, take informed consent, particularly of side effects, and start treatment and schedule follow-up. The key thing is follow-up and compliance, which makes a huge difference in the outcomes. So education would be informing parents and patients about the risk of myopia. So what are the problems of long-term myopia? And it is not just simply wearing glasses, which can be removed when they're 18 years of age. Explain the child's risk profile and the way to reduce avoidable risks. So currently, of course, the profiles are very bad, but otherwise also it's important to profile the child and identify its major risk issues that are there and try and modify them. Inform them about the efficacies and side effects of the control plan you have for the child. Baseline, do a cycloplegic refraction. You can do an AR also, take 3 readings, record mean. There are various issues with ARs, but essentially have a good cycloplegic baseline refraction. Prescribe glasses on the current refraction, do not undercorrect. Document power of glasses or previous spectacles to confirm progression. Axial length measurement has now become a very important measure, because even if refractive error does not significantly change, if axial length progression has not stopped, it really makes no difference in the risk in the long term to eye vision loss related problems. Assessment of binocular vision, including amplitude of accommodation and accommodational lag. This is not usually measured, but it's important because if you start the patient on atropine, this may actually worsen. Again, phoria, especially esophoria. So these patients may require some other form of intervention like basin prisms. Ocular surface health is important if you're planning ortho-K or soft contact lenses, pupillometry, and fundus assessment. So these are very important baseline assessments that you need. Treatment strategy will be based on the risks and the benefits of individual treatment, associated ocular conditions, patient's lifestyle, economic status, and ease of compliance. The options include optical, which would be spectacles. So you have multiple segment associated spectacles with aspheric lens sets, progressive ad lenses, which are now approved for myopia control, bifocals, which are not very effective. In contact lenses, you have ortho-K and soft multifocal contact lenses, again, both of which have shown significant efficacy in controlling myopia progression. Pharmacologically, we are all aware of atropine. It has been tested in different doses, and 0.01 is the most popular, although scientific basis is still not clear. Other drugs are questionable and have, if at all, moderate efficacy. The key intervention that you can make in 100% of children is lifestyle modifications. Increase time outdoors. Even in these COVID times and restricted environment, they could go with safety, protection, and distance. Increase indoor ambient lighting. They can study next to windows. They can take the breaks, which the 2020 rule of APOS AO. So advise lifestyle modifications, and there is now clear evidence that it works. So how do you decide treatment options? One is the age of onset. Less than 4 years, low myopia may actually be part of emetropization and may not require any intervention, which may actually be harmful in the long term. A high myope, it could be a congenital or an ROP, a preterm delivery. You document progression before you start any form of treatment. We know that maximum progression occurs between 6 to 11 years of age. Again, document progression and early intervene based on rate of progression. So progression is important to decide also how aggressively you want to intervene. More than 12 years, again, document progression, decide. They start leveling off at 12 years of age. Only those who progress significantly require intervention. Rate of progression is a very important factor in deciding how aggressively intervene. Ocular surface, if it's problems, you may have to avoid contact lenses. Binocular status, as I mentioned, accommodative lag, esophorias may require peripheral ad lenses or prisms. and of course, environmental modifications and risk assessment. Just key points about treatment. Atropine, low dose atropine, we know the efficacy is maximum between 7 to 12 years of age. So treat at least for 2 years, unless poor effect or side effects. And as of now, we have evidence of 5 years treatment. So you may continue treatment for 5 years if you start very early and is found to be effective. Taper to prevent rebound, and the rebound should be monitored. So follow even after you stop treatment. Contact lenses are continued as long as they are tolerated, up to 14 to 16 years as progression lowers after that. Check for ocular health on regular follow-ups. Multifocal do not have rebound, but the effect wears off over time, and Ortho-K definitely has rebound. And a combination of these has been proved to be more effective than either alone. So assess outcomes at 6 months, 1 year in terms of myopic progression, which is the change in spherical equivalent, in the change in axial length elongation, and of course, look at other parameters like changes in amplitude of accommodation and pupil size. Treatment may be stopped or switched if the myopic progression is not sufficiently controlled compared to expected progression, poor tolerance or side effects, and compliance or safety issues, particularly contact lens related. So just to sum it up, analyze the patient risk profile, select the patient who fits the inclusion criteria specific to the treatment of choice, educate about the benefits and risk of myopia control. Essential basic ocular examination refraction is necessary. Maintain follow-up, make sure that the patient follows up, record the parameters. If required, telephonically keep encouraging them to follow up and maintain treatment, and analyze changes in the refractive error and decide the clinical plan accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rohit. Wonderful presentation again. If the panel wants to ask any question to Dr. Rohit, and in the meanwhile, I request Dr. Shweta to share her screen.
So one question is, would you see axial length and refractive error both, or just the axial length if it's increasing but the refractive error remains the same, supposing the keratometry is decreasing? So would that be a patient candidate for atropine?
So yeah, I mean, only if the refractive error is increasing, and usually we don't have data on axial length, frankly telling you the truth. So retrospective data, it would not be available. So if you're just seeing progression in the appropriate age group, seeing progression of refractive error, you would intervene and start treatment. More importantly, the axial length measurements are more for follow-up, because you could actually monitor after that, and of course help you to decide, is your treatment effective or not. That's the key important investigation on follow-up.
Rohit, one thing I want to
Sorry to interrupt you. Could the host please let Shweta share her screen?
Ma'am, wait.
Can I ask one question?
The Q&A.
Yes, please, sir.
I was just Dr. Rohit.
Yes, sir.
I was just asking with this atropine treatment, how many we are able to prevent their progression from simple myopia to so-called high myopia or pathological myopia? Because that may be a relevant point, that if we are able to prevent that drift from there to there, that may be a significant achievement, or most of them will either way end up there or not end up there. Any take on that?
So, sir, there are, I mean, of course, evidence, individual cases is difficult to give, but there are a lot of projection analysis that are now available, which have said that if you have 33% reduction in progression, you're going to prevent 75% of children crossing 5 diopters if you catch them at less than 1 diopter. If you are able to reduce it by 50%, the curve of progression, you're able to prevent 90% of children from reaching 5 diopters or more. So this is based on projection analysis and the estimated efficacy. We know atropine at low dose is probably effective at 33% only. So we are expecting that if we start early and we see effect in a child and we continue treatment, we expect that up to 75% of the children who have started treatment may not progress to beyond 5 diopters. But again, monitoring case to case is very important. You may have to aggressively up the treatment in the form of higher doses, which I believe is because it is shown to be more effective. You know that 1% effect is extremely effective, but of course is extremely difficult to tolerate. So of course 0.05% as LAMP has worked on, Or again, I think in India we need to evolve a better outcome or better plan as to what is the concentration more effective for Indians. But that is something that is yet to be proven. The other thing is the combination therapy. So if you have a child who is still aggressively progressing, then besides atropine, I would think in terms of adding either ortho-K or soft contact lenses if the parents are willing, or else, like I discussed, aggressively go on to a higher dose, which we may have to actually dispense from in-hospital pharmacy. So yes, there is evidence now that we should be able to prevent a lot of these children going into high myopia. But again, the evidence proof comes when you see prevention of axial length elongation as compared to just simple spherical equivalent change.
So it was an excellent question. I just have a question. So in how many patients you have found esophoria and accommodation lag? Because in my patient, whatever we have worked up, we have not found esophoria or accommodation lag in our set of patients.
So anyway, the most studies that have assessed it have not seen more than 10% of children having significant esophoria and even accommodational lag. The importance of accommodational lag is that possible atropine may worsen the accommodational lag. And in these patients, it is better to think in terms of giving either bifocals or multifocal lenses, and if possible, treat them optically rather than pharmacologically. That's the most important. But yes, very, very small children. Esophorias, I would say I've just seen about 2 cases in the last couple of years. And same accommodational lag it's a very minor accommodational lag which we have picked up. So it's generally not significant clinically. But, and of course, I have not changed my intervention. Usually we will start with atropine in them because of the safety concerns that we would still have in Indian population. And we haven't found them to worsen. So like I said, it's important as we are accumulating data, and nationwide, we have now started so many patients on atropine. It's just important that we maintain data so that maybe over a few years, we are a little wiser in, how we should define our treatment.
Thank you, sir. I would now invite Dr. Shweta to deliver her talk on cerebral visual impairment in children. Dr. Shweta, please.
I want to thank Dr. Jaspreet and Chandigarh Ophthalmological Society for giving me the opportunity to speak on a very important topic, which is cerebral visual impairment in children. What is CVI? Cerebral visual impairment is a condition which is characterized by visual deficit that results from perinatal, postnatal injury to visual processing structures and pathways of a developing brain that cannot be explained by ocular abnormalities alone. Now, while we discuss this entity in detail, it is interesting to note how this term has evolved. Cortical blindness is a term which has been used for acquired bilateral injury to occipital cortex in a fully developed brain. But it has been seen that early onset damage to developing visual system of neonate and infant differs in etiology and characteristics from acquired brain injury of adult. So the term blindness was replaced by visual impairment because these children were rarely profoundly blind because of the plasticity of central nervous system and presence of extrageniculate striate pathway, which prevents a total loss of sight. The word cortical was replaced by cerebral in order to encompass both the higher visual pathway as well as the subcortical structures of the brain. Now, coming to the anatomical consideration, CVI is caused by any disease which affects the pathway or retinotectopulvinar extrastriate pathway. Retinogeniculostriate pathway receives information from the cone-rich areas of the brain, and it extends from optic tract to the primary visual cortex, which is area number 17. Whereas extrageniculate visual pathway receives information from the rod-rich areas of the brain, and it extends from optic tracts via superior colliculus to the parastriate cortex, which is area number 18 and 19, and it is responsible for the blind sight in these children. It is important to note that superior colliculus is central in the extrageniculate visual pathway and is responsible for detection of movement. And this explains why some of the CVI children, they are more attentive to moving objects rather than stationary objects. Now, why do we need to address the problem? CVI is becoming a public health concern in developed nations as well as in developing country like India because of the improved neonatal care. A population-based study in UK of newly diagnosed children with severe vision loss have found that CVI comprises about 48% and was the most common casual disorder. In a US study, which was a survey of school for the blind, found that CVI was the leading cause, comprising about 18%, followed by optic nerve hypoplasia and retinopathy of prematurity. The varied common etiology of CVI includes perinatal and postnatal asphyxia, neonatal hypoglycemia, traumatic brain injury, CNS infections and malformations, hydrocephalus, and neurometabolic disorders. Whatever be the etiology, any insult or injury or complication which interrupts the flow of oxygenated blood results in hypoxia, which is almost always coupled with disrupted autoregulations, which causes reduced cerebral blood flow and ischemia, thereby causing hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. It has a series of excitooxidative cascade of events mediating this type of injury, culminating in mitochondrial injury, which results in cellular depletion of energy, which in severe cases cause necrosis. Nature and severity of brain injury in HIE depends on the severity and duration of hypotension and the degree of brain maturation. Authors have taken this cutoff for the gestational age as 36 weeks, because in preterms, it has been seen that the location of injury is periventricular because of the ventriculopetal supply, whereas in term infants, the location of injury is parasagittal because of the ventriculofugal blood supply. Now, coming to the characterization of visual deficit, visual dysfunction in CVI includes decreased visual perception and acuity because of the damage to the retinogenic striate pathway. Vernier acuity is a more sensitive measure than grating acuity for quantifying visual deficit in patients with CVI, and vernier acuity is relatively lower than grating acuity in children. Such children also shows visual field deficit, visual motor deficit, oculomotor impairment, and cognitive visual processing. Visual perception and cognition, which includes visual memory, visual search, and visual attention, they have reciprocal relationship and are interdependent for their development. And CVI children, they have both the visual perceptual and visual cognitive deficit. Higher level visual processing is divided into dorsal stream and ventral stream pathway. Neurobehavioral signs pertaining to dorsal stream impairment includes impaired visual attention. These children look visually blind, but they are generally visually inattentive. Then these children have photophobia. Like you can see this child closes the eye as soon as the light is shown in their eyes. Many children are light gazers. Like you can see this child is having focal seizure at the moment, but as soon as the seizure subsides and the child is active, you can see the child start gazing at the light source. Then they have affinity towards bright color and moving objects. They have impaired visual curiosity, visual search, and their visual latency is increased. They have optic ataxia, which means they have impaired visual guidance of movement. Dyskineptopsia, which means impaired perception of movement. Simultagnosia, which means that they have limited capacity to simultaneously see many things at a time in a frame. Apraxia of gaze, which means inability to move eyes towards a target. Then these children look away while reaching for an object. Like you can see this child looks away while grabbing the object. Then impaired distance vision. They have a problem with the distance vision. Then they have impaired perception in the lower field. This is a visual field of a 21-year-old male with periventricular leukomalacia and having vision of around 624. And this patient is having a field defect in the lower field. Then they have crowding phenomena. They have a foreground and background clutter. They have problem with visual novelty. That means they will stick to their old toys and they will ignore the newer ones. Then they have understanding the complex structures and they will prefer simpler ones. Then they have impairment in spatial orientation and navigation. Like this child CVI child has drawn eyes at the bottom and lips at the top. Ventral stream impairment includes impaired recognition of face, facial expressions, objects, shapes, letters. Then they have impaired visual memory and impaired orientation. These children have problems sustaining eye contact and they have odd behavior in crowded environment. Coming to the ocular motility, exotropia is a commoner presentation. Children with periventricular leukomalacia often present with esotropia. Many children shows dyskinetic strabismus in which esotropia changes to exotropia on a momentary basis. We have seen many children with tonic down gaze. Nystagmus, rhythmic nystagmus is very rare, but many children shows roving eye movements with intermittent or unsustained beats of nystagmus. Children with periventricular leukomalacia display latent or manifest strabismus, nystagmus. Coming to refraction, myopia is common in premature children who have retinopathy of prematurity, whereas children with periventricular leukomalacia without ROP shows hypermetropia and astigmatism. Children with cerebral palsy shows hypermetropia. Accommodation dysfunction is common in these children. Coming to the optic disc, normal disc is seen in 56%, whereas pallor is seen in 24%. Children with periventricular leukomalacia less than 28 weeks, they have generally hypoplastic disc, whereas periventricular leukomalacia after 28 weeks, they have pseudoglaucomatous disc with large cup and reduced neuroretinal rim area. Coming to the electrophysiology, authors have shown low positive predictive value of VP in patients with CVI. They have not found VP valuable in diagnosing. Many authors are of view that bad VP result does not necessarily mean a poor future outcome. Many authors have suggested sweep VP to be a valuable tool in measuring visual acuity of children who have CVI. A word about brain imaging. Brain imaging in preterm differs from term infants. Preterm infants have periventricular leukomalacia, which could be focal, adjacent to the frontal horns and trigones, or it could be diffuse with ventriculomegaly and thinning of corpus callosum. In severe cases, the cyst may coalesce to form a cystic encephalomalacia. Imaging pattern in terms are of two types: watershed predominant pattern at the parasagittal area extending to the cortical gray matter, and another type is basal ganglia pattern involving the deep gray nuclei and perirolandic cortex. So to sum up, current trends suggest that incidence of CVI is rising, and associated comorbidities in CVI patients make the diagnosis and characterization of the underlying visual impairment a challenge. The variability in location and extent of brain injury across individuals makes the prediction of visual functional outcome and recovery challenging, and there is a need to practice effective rehabilitative and education strategies for individuals living with this condition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shweta. I think communication and awareness about CVI is the need of the hour. If I could have one comment or any question for Dr. Shweta.
Just one thing, how will you know whether it's ocular, brain-based, or both? I mean, that's a very important point in children to know what we are dealing with. I mean, so I think CVI instead of CVI probably, because cortical, subcortical, so it's a better term to use a brain-based visual impairment. But then how? I mean, it's important to differentiate also what we are, it's brain-based, ocular, or it's a combined mechanism.
Sir, generally, the diagnosis should be a combination of many factors. Like, first of all, the history is important, history taking. In history, we could get the history of birth asphyxia, delayed cry, or meconium aspiration, or something suggestive. Then examination, we have to see certain neurobehavioral signs which are there in these children and which can be picked up. And thirdly, it should be corroborated with brain imaging also, because these children show brain changes in the brain pattern. So this is all these factors help in diagnosing the case.
Thank you. I think if there are no more questions, we can move on to the next talk, and that's obviously a talk on amblyopia. And it will be by our moderator, Sabreen Kaur, an assistant professor here.
Thank you, sir. I'm here to talk about changing trends in the management of amblyopia. And to start off, I would talk about some trends that have stayed the same over the last maybe centuries. The best corrected visual acuity on logMAR-based tests has to be measured in any child where we are suspecting amblyopia. We prescribe refractive correction based on cycloplegic retinoscopy. We ask the child to wear spectacles full time and then monitor visual acuity every 6 to 12 weeks, and then establish the type and density of amblyopia before we start the therapy. The traditional management of amblyopia is by patching or penalization, and further followed by surgical rehab in cases of maybe some cases of strabismic amblyopia, where alignment might contribute to the binocularity. We have the PEDIC studies, which have been the basis of treatment given all over the world in cases of amblyopia. Broadly, the anisometropic amblyopia being treated with glasses and improvement with glasses noted in 77%, 2 hours and then 6 hours patching in mild, moderate, and severe cases respectively. Glasses alone in bilateral refractive amblyopia, Atropine has been proven to be similar to patching in moderate cases, and weakened atropine is a suitable option. In older children, we give optical correction, which improves visual acuity in, say, about 25%, and then amblyopia therapy in a similar manner, which gives a response depending on the age at which we start the therapy. There is the lacunae of residual amblyopia and some types of amblyopia, including deprivation amblyopia, which has not been studied in the trials, and the protocols are largely evidence as well as experience-based. The efficacy of patching is proven in literature and we have seen it, but it is of course limited by poor compliance and decreased effect with advancing age. So what's new in amblyopia and why are we talking about it? There are certain disadvantages of existing therapies, and of course, talking about residual amblyopia in older children and adults which present for the first time, the current therapy, the gold standard patching, sometimes fails to give us answers. So we want to now move on from a poor binocular outcome given by patching, because patching is basically involving monoocular mechanism. Now that we have the fMRI studies, which tells us that amblyopia is structurally a problem that causes the binocular system to work as a monoocular system. So we have shifted to approaches that would direct the binocular visual function as the primary therapeutic step and not only improve the vision, but also the stereopsis and contrast in some cases. The newer therapies are basically perceptual learning, video game based or dichoptic, or a combination of the two. Essentially, the perceptual learning involves administering a single visual percept in monoocular conditions to the patients. It's based on the principle that practice makes one perfect, and we give a lot of tasks which improve the neural connections and hence are known to improve the visual acuity in these patients. The dichoptic therapy gives an independent stimulus to each eye, and the brain is forced to integrate the two images. Of course, it is the stimuli given to both eyes may be different in terms of the contrast offered, and they are shorter duration, they are fun to do, and they do not require patching because in contrast to the perceptual learning, we are now making the patient use both eyes. The clinical studies over the time that have been done, mainly again quoting the PDIG RCTs, when they compared initially 7 days per week of patching with 1 hour of video games, the initial studies said that there was a lot of poor compliance to these therapies because the child felt the game was boring to play for more than 1 hour. And the compliance in these studies also dropped down to say about 22%, which was as good as patching. So authors speculated that we need to make the games more interesting. And so the newer trials and the iPad therapy that became very popular in the United States documented a better adherence, mainly because they asked the child to use red-green anaglyphic glasses and then give different contrast stimuli. The Digrush game that became very popular gave a higher contrast stimuli to the amblyopic eye, and a gold mining game that was considered to be more compliant. But again, the results were equivalent to patching. In an Indian perspective, if I look at the literature, once you do a Google search, I find my study, our study from our center, which said that in 2021 also, again, part-time occlusion is being followed as the main therapy and the gold standard. We now have the Revital therapy, which was launched in India, again, based on perceptual learning. And they have evidence that 2.5 lines of improvement in visual acuity was observed, along with an improvement in contrast as well. It is based on a therapy that target and flankers are projected into the eye, and somehow the patient has to point out as to which image has 3 or which image has 2. Facial frequencies differed, orientation of these stimuli are differed, and so they are done in precise control conditions. They can be frankly quite boring to do, but require repetition and is known to improve the neuronal efficiency. There is a lot of literature available on perceptual vision therapy, but not from India. The Binox dichoptic amblyopia therapy is an indigenous dichoptic video game based treatment, again using a software for improvement of binocular vision. It's a patented therapy. The games are more fun to do because again they are dichoptic, and after that a series of games came from India, and some anecdotal reports to tell us that there is evidence of using dichoptic therapy comparable, again comparable and not superior to the part-time patching for amblyopia. The video games that we have now come across a lot of studies on the video games. but they're small case series. They might not be RCTs. They have all mixed types of children being treated. Some had previous pharmacotherapy also. So again, if we look at virtual reality games also, there was no documented improvement in terms of comparison to patching, and we need more evidence required, more evidence to prove their superiority over the traditional treatment. Certain disclaimers to this therapy. These newer therapies, which look very interesting, they are basically task dependent and they depend on the type that you use. They are again dependent on, they might not work for all types of amblyopia. They have been done in lab settings. Again, very few RCTs and very few studies on these perceptual learning tasks in clinic-based settings. Dichoptic therapy, again, variable studies, wide age range, any type of amblyopia, and previous records are not taken into consideration. So their clinical usefulness lies in the fact that some children may demonstrate excellent compliance on these games. They can be good candidates for binocular therapy. You may try this therapy in an adult or patients who are not showing any improvement with patching. Compliance again is a problem with gaming exercises, and also there's a problem with cost, with the language in a country like ours, computer literacy being a major drawback in these therapies. We have pharmacotherapies also, which have been tried for a long time, but they have not, gone by. They have been showing promising results as an adjunct to therapy of patching again. This is just a experience-based algorithm that I have written. It is not based on a lot of evidence, but in a child aged 3 to 7 years, patching and then increased patching and then more compliance and maybe penalization, to my opinion, works. In an age group of 7 to 12 years, vigorous patching again if they were not treated before, and you might think of switching to now the gaming therapies if available. In an older child or maybe an adult, I always want to give a trial of patching if they were not treated. Even if they were treated in an erratic manner, patching should be given, and you might supplement it with the gaming therapies. To summarize, conventional therapy is still the gold standard. There are pilot studies on newer therapies, which I think can be tried in children who have failed occlusion or in adults. We might look at stereopsis and contrast also in these patients. Dichoptic therapy or any therapy which is shorter duration might seem more interesting. And of course, it is unclear whether this is a response to binocular treatment because of poor adherence or because of poor compliance or the treatment itself. So we need more evidence-based answers on the newer therapies. I would like to acknowledge Dr. Jasprit for he's behind all my presentations and all my work, and of course my junior residents and my senior residents at Advanced Eye Center. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for a nice presentation. We can have one or two final concluding comments. Rohit, would you like to say something?
So, excellent talk, Dr. Sableen. It covers up essentially what we still keep thinking, that probably conventional occlusion still remains the gold standard for amblyopia therapy. And the largest number of children are expected to improve by conventional occlusion. For those who have compliance issues and or have failed, one may try these VR-based interventions or video games or additional interventions that can help to one, sustain the child's interest in amblyopia therapy, as well as help us to probably tide over the initial hump. Is the biggest thing to cover in amblyopia therapy. Once the vision starts improving beyond 6-18 or so, when the child is comfortable with the amblyopic eye, then I think the problems are a little less, although by that time fatigue also sometimes sets in. But the initial hump, if we can get over, then probably intermittent patch also or part-time patching at home is the key thing. And anyway, patching I have now virtually entirely shifted to part-time, and especially at home. Never send the kids to school with a patch for two reasons. One, they are very, very uncomfortable, and children can be very blunt and cruel. So it can be, very dissuading for the child. And the other thing, it can be monitored. Children are more intelligent than us. We know the next generation is more intelligent. They find out ways to overcome the, patch or whatever we give them. So that's why always patching at home under parental supervision with as much, entertainment they want on the tab or phone or whatever. So that's what I would say. And as Dr. Savleen has pointed out, that I think, patching still remains the sheet anchor for intervention at the moment, especially in our country.
It's very nice to hear that you shifted from full-time to part-time. I mean, I just wanted to hear those words.
And Mbappe is a well, actually, so much for 150 years or I mean a long time, and we are quite in a directionless to some extent. It's a very difficult situation.
Hopefully things, as more research goes, actually no research was going on. Frankly, nobody, now we are finding it, multinational companies interested in, evaluating and giving us management options. Till now, individual doctors, small institutions working on, minor different kind of interventions was not, leading to any good research. So I hope with a lot of fMRI, a lot of, perceptual learning issues that we are realizing are there, we should get something over time that may, shift.
We have to create commerce, I think. Once there's money, somehow we have to create some commerce. I think if there's no money, it's very difficult to sustain anything in this modern times, Another thing, can we consider amblyopia as a cerebral visual impairment due to abnormal visual experiences? Broadly, with bold fMRI and all those findings, I think those things come a bit closer. With time, maybe we are able to blur that gap. Because it's a visual cortical visual impairment only. It is not located in the eye. So the roads are very close, I think.
I think Dr. Srishti has some
Dr.
experience.
Rohit,
Yeah.
2 questions. One is, in older children or adults, is it the full-time patching still work better than the part-time patching? And second is stimulation of the higher visual functions, as I am referring to Dr. Santhan Gopal's view. Is that does that work also?
So I'll answer the first question, full-time versus part-time. There is, I would still say that full-time will work faster and is more, it's essentially what many studies have talked about, total duration of patching. So if your total duration of patching is divided into multiple days, hours, a small number of hours per day, your total days increase. If you have lesser number of days, you'll have to do a larger greater hours of patching. But the problems with full-time patching are what I said, the compliance issues come in. If the vision start off is very poor in the amblyopic eye, then the child has risk of getting injured. So often the children will not go to school. So that is why I'm not really saying that full-time patching is not superior or equivalent or whatever in total duration of hours of patching to part-time patching, but it's probably more convenient, more practical in today's world where even parents are not there to supervise children, to think of part-time patching as a more convenient and effective way of giving treatment.
I'm asking older children more than 15 years and adults.
Even then, sir, even in them, again, for an older patient, if you ask him to patch full-time and he has moderate vision in the other eye, he will not be able to function. So he will become, functionally poorly productive. So unless he stops doing work or something like that, those become, if a patient is willing, sure, I would say if he's willing to think of a full-time patch, I would say, especially an older patient, I would say give a full-time patch for, of course, in a ratio, give a, break 6:1 as we practice at our center, but give a break so that there is no occlusion of amblyopia, if at all. And then see in a month, if it shows some form of improvement, you may actually think of shifting to part-time occlusion and move on. So you'll know that there is some likelihood of improvement. Otherwise, you may actually discuss discontinuing occlusion.
So
And yeah,
okay. Our experience is that where we have counseled the adults and older children for a full-time patching, at least initial period for 1 or 2 months,
yes.
they have given a better result as compared to part-time patching.
I like I said, I mean, there is no reason to say that full-time patching will not give a better result. Like I said, it will. It's a question of practicality and feasibility. So if a patient is willing and if you think they can manage, sure. What in our experience we were realizing when we were giving full-time occlusion was that children were anyway occluding for 6 to 8 hours only. So no child would, often go to school with a patch, or if they go to school with a patch, they just remove it. or when they go out to play, they won't play. So those are issues. That's why we kind of, for practicality, moved to part-time instead of full-time. But no doubt full-time would still work. And I have not tried Dr. Santan Gopal's machine as of now, so I would not be able to.
But what was claiming about internuclear ophthalmology, Dr. Santan Gopal, and I wrote in one of the WhatsApp groups, I found it very, very, I thought of a miracle. And he could not explain things. I posed a query also, if some of you read that, maybe I don't remember. So he did not answer those issues, because you cannot change motor aspect. You cannot treat INO with his equipment, and his results are very dramatic, too dramatic to be believed, I think. So one has to be.
Well, let's not disbelieve in miracles. Let's hope that a miracle cure will come. We should always look forward to miracles. Let's hope that it stands the test of time and multiple evaluations. So, I would say any research, any thoughts are encouraging and should be encouraged. And we should, if it itself may not be great, it may help us or lead us to an idea which can be developed and actually give us a good intervention. So, at the moment, as I have no experience, I can only comment on other people's experience who have said that it is fairly effective. But even then, I would say it may be effective only in small percentage of children with certain issues. So I guess so. Again, without experience,
also, we don't know. There could be some placebo effect, and I told him to do gold fMRI on some patients and show objective data so that there is evidence.
No. First step is to collect effectivity data. How it works is a later on issue. First, to show in multiple centers in a large number of patients in a homogeneous population that it is effective in improving visual acuity from this baseline to this baseline, which is statistically significant, and compare it if possible to a occlusion therapy, and then show evidence. And then if it works, then yes, it's very good. And then we start looking at how it works on a scientific basis.
So let's wait for more evidence. With this evolving literature, probably we'll have more answers. And it's time now to end this magical session. And thank you so much, Dr. Pandey and Rohit, for sparing your time for our Chandigarh Ophthalmology Society meeting. And I'd like to thank other panelists as well, Dr. Srishti Raj, Dr. Amit, Dr. Shweta, and our moderator, Dr. Sableen. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jaspreet.
Thank you, Jaspreet, Sableen, Dr. Raj, Shweta, Amit, and Dr. Pandey. Thank you. Wonderful being here.
Thank you, Dr. and Dr. Rohit and Dr. Sableen and everyone. It was a wonderful session. It was nice being together. We all enjoyed interaction. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasleen.